Tad Vishnu Paramam Padam Shri Vishnu Shri Vishnu Shri Vishnu. Very good. So again, today we're going to be talking about a special topic, and hopefully just briefly, maybe for just half an hour or so, and that is the philosophy and practice of vegetarianism. You know, for individuals who are somewhat familiar with yoga, with Hinduism, with Sanatana-Dharma, with anything Vedic, we know that vegetarianism is a very, very important practice. We know that all of the great sages and yogis practiced vegetarianism. We know that, again, it's something that is a central pillar as far as the ethical behavior of what it means to be a follower of Sanatana-Dharma. Well, I just want to talk a little bit about why that is in fact the case, both philosophically and practically as well. Before I dive into the philosophical aspects of vegetarianism, however, I just want to talk about my own experience with vegetarianism just a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, before we began this talk, for myself, I've been vegetarian since I was approximately 12 years old or so. The reason why I became vegetarian, interestingly, was for purely spiritual and ethical reasons. You know, I began practicing Sanatana-Dharma, and very specifically practicing yoga, meditation, and pranayama when I was about 10 years old, something like that. I began reading quite a few books on yoga very specifically. And one thing that I kept seeing again and again and again with all of these authors on yoga and yoga philosophy and practice, with the stories of famous yogis all throughout history, one pattern that I kept seeing is that they were all vegetarian and very strict about this. And very quickly I understood, oh, well, what it means to be a yogi is you have to be vegetarian. There's no way around that. There are no serious yogis who are not vegetarian. At that point, I realized, well, if I'm going to be a serious yogi, then I should become vegetarian as well. Well, I don't know what inspired me when I was that young, but I realized that if I was going to do this seriously, I had to do it as a slow and intelligent transition. You know, again, I don't know why, but for some reason I just kind of intuitively knew that if I just dived into it and went from being a complete meat eater to the next day saying, okay, I'm just going to go cold turkey and just have no meat whatsoever, I knew that wouldn't be a good idea. So I decided to do instead was take my time with it, and it took me really about 9 months or so to become a complete vegetarian. At first, I stopped eating all red meats, so, you know, all serious meats, beef especially, I just stopped eating. Then after a little while, I stopped other types of meats, so poultry, things like that. After that, I stopped eating fish completely, and truthfully, I was never a really big fish eater, but still, I stopped completely with all fish, and then finally eggs. And then by the time this, again, approximately 9-month period or so was over, I was complete vegetarian. You know, I was abstaining from all meat, fish, and eggs. And by the time that happened, again, I was about 12, so I may have started this at 11. I don't really remember. It was a very long time ago at this point. But very purposefully, I decided to do this very slow transition. So now, because this worked for me very well, you know, I'm 48 now, and I've been vegetarian ever since, this is what I always suggest to people. That if they're going to choose to be vegetarian, that they not do it in a fanatical sort of way. See, one thing that we've seen about Sanatana-Dharma is that practiced intelligently, correctly, there's no fanaticism ever involved. You know, it's a very practical path. So even when becoming vegetarian, if a person approaches me and says, oh, I've been so inspired and I would like to become vegetarian now and I'm thinking I'm going to give up meat tomorrow, you'd be surprised that I, of all people, tell them, no, don't give up meat tomorrow. Don't just go cold turkey. Why do I tell them that? Because I've seen many people who did try going cold turkey. They will stop eating all meat, and 3 months later, they're back at it. Going cold turkey really doesn't work. So I always tell them, take your time with it, and I tell them my story and tell them to kind of try to do the same thing. Now, when it comes to reasons for being vegetarian, there are many reasons. Health-wise, certainly, at this point it is beyond dispute whatsoever. Reputable MDs, reputable researchers, reputable doctors have all said that eating meat contributes to heart disease, contributes to cancer. What to speak of course, all the toxins that are there in meat. Certainly that can be avoided by eating, what do they call it, free-range meat and things like that, organic meat. That may or may not be the case, but as far as health, that's only one reason. That's a very good reason for giving up meat. In addition to that, being vegetarian makes sense economically from a more global perspective. It's interesting, a lot of people aren't aware of this. People will use this as a criticism of India all the time. I've heard this for 40 years now. All these Hindus, they're all starving. They should eat all those cows that are just wandering around. Really? Well, interestingly, it takes 16 pounds of grain that you have to feed to that cow to get 1 pound of meat. The truth of the matter is that if you wanted to end starvation within 48 hours, stop killing cows. And instead give that grain directly to people and have them eat. Instead of feeding it to a cow, and again, for every 16 pounds of grain that you feed that cow, you only get 1 pound of meat.
And grain isn't their original food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, it's very interesting. From an economic perspective, this makes sense. Also, from an environmental perspective, it makes very much sense to be vegetarian. I forget what the statistics are now, but I remember several years ago, it was something like 2.5 acres of land in the rainforest in Central and South America are being destroyed. A lot of people don't understand why it's being destroyed. People have heard this. People know, they're destroying the rainforest, they're decimating the rainforest. Why are they doing this? Well, a large part of the reason is so that they can then have grazing land for cows, for meat consumers in North America. The reason why all of these rainforests are being destroyed is basically so that we can have Big Macs, so we can have Whoppers, so we can have hamburgers. And, I've actually heard it said, I don't know how accurate this is, but I've heard it actually said that essentially, at least symbolically, you can envision every time you have a Whopper, that's a tree in the rainforest that was just destroyed for that hamburger. So from an environmental perspective, it makes complete sense to reduce our meat consumption and to go more toward a vegetarian diet. For this reason, for decades now, actually, various environmental organizations have been encouraging vegetarianism because they also understand this principle, that the more vegetables we eat, the less meat that we eat, the better it is for the rainforest, the better it is for the environment. The meat industry is one of the largest polluters of water in the United States, maybe the largest, because all of the sludge, all of that horrible stuff that is left over, basically, after they've killed all the animals, they then throw into rivers, So if we care about the environment, becoming vegetarian is something that would be very, very helpful. The most important reasons, however, for becoming vegetarian are certainly spiritual and ethical. And that's really what I want to focus on. From a spiritual perspective, and I'll deal with this first in a more overt way, but really the rest of the talk will be focusing more on the spiritual. But in a more overt way, from the spiritual perspective, what are we trying to do when we practice yoga? What are we trying to do when we practice meditation, when we practice any form of spiritual life, spiritual practice? We're trying to transform our consciousness, stated very simply. We're trying to go from a level of consciousness in which we are focusing on our own needs, in which we are focusing on, let's say, all sorts of anarthas, all sorts of negative emotions, anger, fear, lust, etc., and instead trying to transform ourselves in such a way that our true consciousness, our Atman, shines forth. Well, that being the case, part of what it means to practice sadhana is that with everything that we are doing, we understand that we are coloring our consciousness. The way it's been described is this. If you can envision that, let's say you have a jar that's made out of glass, you can see through it, and you have just plain water in there. Well, of course, if you add different color dyes, that water will become like that color. Let's say you add a blue dye, well, it will become blue. You add a red dye, it will become red. Well, that water is like our consciousness. It is meant to be pure. It's meant to be natural. Well, anything that comes into us, anything that comes into our senses, colors our consciousness, quite literally transforms our consciousness, either for the good or for the bad. This is why the yogi tries to make sure that everything that they see, everything they hear, everything they taste, etc., anything that comes through the senses is something which is going to elevate them, not do the opposite. Not do the opposite. Well, this is true for food as well. Have we not heard that you are what you eat? Well, that's quite literally true. It's not just a nice saying that our grandparents used to say. It's quite literally true. Eat garbage, well, you're going to feel like garbage. You're going to feel lethargic, you're going to feel unhealthy, you're going to start looking unhealthy. Eat very healthy foods and you will feel healthy. Eat very healthy foods, natural foods, organic foods, and what will happen? Suddenly your thinking will be clearer, sharper, faster. Suddenly you will literally begin seeing the world differently. Everything about your consciousness will change. Well, this is a very important principle to understand when it comes to vegetarianism. Understanding that anything that we bring into us changes us. Anything that we see will change us. If we watch a horrible, let's say, horror movie where people are being murdered versus watching something that's elevating, a spiritual movie. Listening to just truly horrible music, which is probably most music today, versus listening to spiritual music, etc., etc. Well, try to understand and envision this. What do you think would be the effect on our consciousness of eating foods that are natural, that are healthy, that are organic, that are, for example, fruits and vegetables and grains and legumes, versus eating the dead corpse of an animal that was tortured to death, that was traumatized? And now you are ingesting that within you. That will have an effect on your consciousness. That will change who and what you are. And more, how will it affect you? Well, what was the cause of this hamburger that we're eating, or this leg of chicken that we got at Kentucky Fried Chicken? Violence. It's as a result of violence that we are eating that. Well, little by little, we will begin to have a violent, agitated mind, which is the very opposite of what we're trying to achieve. When we're sitting still in meditation, are we doing this in order to achieve anxiety? In order to achieve a conflictual, violent sort of mind? No, of course not. The opposite. The opposite. And yet we're taking into our mouths the corpse of an innocent animal that was traumatized, literally tortured. This cannot but have an effect on our consciousness. So, very important to understand this. I'm going to talk a little bit about I'm going to talk more about this a little bit later, actually. But one thing I want to mention in relationship to yoga is the concept of ahimsa. When we practice yoga, when we practice Sanatana-Dharma, we have an entire ethical system that we try to incorporate in our lives. And everything that we think and everything that we say and everything that we do, we try to live as ethically and as good as possible. Well, one of these ethical codes is what is called ahimsa. This means nonviolence. Nonviolence. So, I don't want to go too deeply into this because we're going to be talking about that a little bit more a little bit later. But I do want to talk about ethics a little bit now. For myself, again, getting back to my own personal story, my reason for becoming vegetarian at the age of 12 was precisely spiritual and ethical reasons. In addition to understanding that, well, okay, if I'm going to be a yogi, that means I have to live the way I've seen other yogis living, and I've read that other yogis live. They're all vegetarians, so therefore I have to be a vegetarian. And that wasn't the only ethical decision I made, but it was certainly one of the major ones. But this being the case, I began to contemplate, well, why is it that they are vegetarians. Certainly there are all the reasons that we spoke about as far as coloring our consciousness, etc. But then I realized, after a little bit more reading and study, that there's also the ethical component of vegetarianism. You know, if we want to become beings who are at peace, how can we cause the opposite of peace to other beings? You know, how can we cause suffering? How can we cause anxiety? And even the so-called least of beings. You know, a chicken, a pig, a cow. You know, for so many people, beings like this are just considered to be so vastly different from them that they consider them to be of no importance. Well, not for the yogi. For the yogi, even a chicken is consciousness, is Atman. Is something that is not only alive, but that is truly a soul, just as legitimately as they are soul. You know? So this being the case, how can a true yogi cause pain to other beings? So part of my own personal decision was also ethics, not wanting to cause suffering to other beings. Now I want to talk about this a little bit from a more philosophical perspective. You know, I've written several articles about this, some of which are available on Dharma Central, some of which are available in other places. But in the Western world especially, which is where we're all living now, is in the West, it's been very interesting how there have been several attempts at philosophical refutation against vegetarianism, where individuals have tried to basically attack the idea of vegetarianism. I just want to deal with some of these ideas. Several of them. One of which is the idea of the superiority of human beings. You know, this is one argument that the non-vegetarian will make. Well, but you know, we're vastly superior to these other animals, so therefore that gives us the right to eat them. No. No. You know, I can tell by everyone's faces that you can already kind of tell that this argument doesn't make sense. Being superior to another being does not give you the right to abuse that being, you see. In a way, could you not say that the parent is quote-unquote superior to a child, to a baby? Oh, sure, they have more experience, more intelligence, they're physically stronger. Does that give them the right to then abuse that baby? Of course not. Of course not. In fact, on the contrary, we do indeed believe that, sure, there is a hierarchy of being, you know. This idea of radical egalitarianism is nonsense. No, of course, a human being on the hierarchy of being is placed higher than, let's say, a chicken. That's true. However, if a human being is indeed superior, what is it that makes them superior? It is their reasoning ability and the fact that they have the ability to choose the good rather than the bad. Thus, when a human being refuses to act as an ethical person, as an ethical being, they are no longer superior. You see, what shows our quote-unquote superiority is that a human being can indeed say to themselves, I choose not to kill this animal. I choose not to kill this animal and to instead have a different diet because I don't want to cause pain, I don't want to cause suffering. So if anything, vegetarianism in itself is a hallmark of our quote-unquote superiority, not the opposite. Okay? So this is one interesting argument that people have made. The other argument that's been made, and very specifically in Christian theology, was first made, I believe, by Thomas Aquinas in his Summa Theologica, where he actually deals with this question. And that is the difference between, let's say, human beings as moral agents versus animals as moral agents. And it may seem like a complex argument, but it's actually very, very simple. This is what a Thomas Aquinas and other people along his line would state. Well, the reason why we have the right to eat animals is because we have the ability to reason, they don't. And more, we have the ability to communicate. We can speak. We have language. Animals don't. Therefore, we have the right to eat them. Okay? I can already see people are making faces. You know, this is a pretty silly argument just intuitively. Well, let me not just intuitively, but rationally explain why it's a very silly argument. First, it's been pointed out by many philosophers of ethics in the 20th and 21st century especially, that if one were to accept this argument that, okay, only beings who are capable of reason and of speaking really should be objects of moral concern, well, this is the problem. There are a lot of human beings who wouldn't fall in that category. You see? So for example, again, to use the baby as an example, well, let's say you have a 6-month baby. Is that baby reasoning right then? No. That baby is not engaging in philosophical dialogue with you, no matter how much you'll try to engage in a philosophical dialogue with that baby. So the baby is not engaging in reason. That baby is engaging in sucking its thumb. Other thing, is that baby at the age of 6 months capable of communicating, capable of speaking with you? No. Well, if you follow this argument then that, well, this is the reason why we can eat animals, well then we should be able to eat babies. Because they also are not reasoning, they also are not communicating with us. Okay? So right there that argument kind of falls apart. But again, playing devil's advocate, Asura's advocate. Let's just say that the individual who's against vegetarianism could very easily come back and say, well, yes, that's true. There, you might see some artificial parallel between a baby and an animal. However, this is the difference. The baby, at the very least, has the potential in time, once it grows up, to then reason, to then communicate. The animal doesn't have that potential. Oh, okay. Seems that we're defeated now, does it not? No. This is the reason why. Again, this argument can be made, interestingly, about quite a few human beings as well. So for example, what if you have a human being who was born mute and, let's say, with some sort of developmental disability? Okay? They're mute, they can't speak. They have a developmental disability, they're probably not going to engage in philosophy. All right? Well, then, according to this argument, we should be able to eat them. Again, human burgers instead of hamburgers. You know? How many of us have parents? We all have parents. Some of us have had parents who, again, imagine if you had a parent who was mute and then gets old enough to the point where they start to develop Alzheimer's disease. Okay? And little by little, that reasoning ability that they had begins to go away and go away. Well, again, if you follow this anti-vegetarian argument, well, they can't communicate, and now they have Alzheimer's. They can't reason either. They don't even know their own name. Well, we should start eating them. Isn't that a silly argument? So again, this is the problem, is that any argument that you could come up with for why it's okay to eat animals, you can also say the same thing about certain classes of human beings. You know, thus the ethical argument in and of itself falls apart. All right? And, you know, we can go on like this. Essentially, this is where the issue gets confused on the part of individuals who feel that they can philosophically justify the idea of eating meat. They are mistaking moral agents for objects of moral concern. Let me explain what I mean by this. In order to be a moral agent, in other words, in order to be an individual who has the ability to make moral decisions, you have to be rational. Yes. So it's true, only human beings can be moral agents. In other words, only human beings have the ability to rationalize and, as I said earlier, choose that, okay, this is unethical, therefore I won't do it. Animals don't really have that ability. However, even though animals are not moral agents, they are objects of moral concern, just like the baby, just like the person with developmental disability or with Alzheimer's. That human may have lost the ability to make moral judgments. However, they are still an object of moral concern. We still have to treat them morally from our perspective. You understand? Now why? See, this begs the question. Because if you wanted to be a radical materialist, one could say, well, okay, well, why? You know, why shouldn't I eat my grandmother who now has Alzheimer's? This is what a radical materialist atheist could actually say, you know? And then, of course, by extension, well, you know, why should animals be objects of moral concern? This is the ultimate criterion by which we determine whether a being is an object of moral concern. Very simple. Can they experience suffering? Can they experience suffering? Why do we not kill that baby and eat it? Even though it's not rational, even though it can't communicate with us, and in fact it's a lot of work to take care of it. Why is it that a normal human being would not consider eating that baby? Because we understand that that baby can suffer. We understand what is the inner content of the essential being of that baby. And that essential being is not different from us. Would we want someone to eat us once we get old? If we lost the ability to speak, would we want someone to eat us? Of course not. Why? Because we know that would be suffering. Thus, that's why we don't eat the baby. That's why we don't eat the person with Alzheimer's or developmental disability. That's why we don't eat animals. Because they don't want to be eaten. Because how do we eat animals? We just kind of make a wish and suddenly they become transformed into a hamburger? No. We must make them suffer. That's the only way that you take a cow and make it into a Whopper. You have to kill it. You have to kill it. You see? So it is impossible to be a meat eater and not be involved in the process of the suffering of other living beings. It leads to one more interesting argument that I just want to touch upon. Well, but I didn't kill the cow that McDonald's sold me as a Big Mac. I wasn't there. I didn't actually kill the cow. So I'm not involved in its suffering. Really? No. Well, how's this for a similar argument? I didn't kill your father. I wasn't there. I didn't pull the trigger. I just paid for the hitman to do it. Not only am I responsible, I'm directly responsible. The hitman would not even have killed your father had I not paid him. But yet I wasn't there. I didn't pull the trigger. Similarly, yes, one can say, well, but I didn't kill the cow. You know, McDonald's or whoever their employees are somewhere killed the cow. Yes, but they would not have killed the cow. In fact, McDonald's would not even exist if you didn't walk through their doors every day and buy a Big Mac. You know? So merely because you weren't there with a knife in your hand to kill another living being, but you paid for the services of that being killed so that you could then eat its body, you're just as responsible, just as morally culpable. You know? In fact, even more so than the person who actually had the knife and killed, because that person would not have killed just for fun. They killed because they were paid to. That assassin shot your father because he was paid to. He didn't shoot your father for fun. He doesn't even know your father. So if anything, the person who is paying is more responsible for the death and suffering of that being. So from a philosophical, ethical, logical perspective, from a health perspective, environmental, economic perspective, from quite literally every perspective, especially a spiritual perspective, vegetarianism makes complete sense, absolute sense. Not finished just yet. Just a few things I want to talk about very quickly, and that is the concept of ahimsa, non-violence. As I said earlier, non-violence is a very, very central concept to all of yoga, to all of Sanatana-Dharma. However, unfortunately, like with many various aspects of Sanatana-Dharma, there are too many stereotypes surrounding this concept of ahimsa or non-violence. You know, I've said this before, I haven't said this recently, but unfortunately when it comes to Sanatana-Dharma, or what sometimes people call Hinduism, there are probably more misconceptions, more stereotypes about our path than every other religion on earth combined. You know, I have been known in the past, years ago, to do an entire class just trying to deal with just a small number of some of the stereotypes of Sanatana-Dharma. Well, this is one of them, and it's a major one, this concept of ahimsa, of nonviolence. Unfortunately, many people have the false notion that what is meant by nonviolence is pacifism. is the idea that, oh yes, I will never engage in violence, even if it means self-defense, even if it means defending the innocent, even if it means, no, that is not the case in any way, shape, or form. If we look at the history of Sanatana-Dharma, what we find is a dual interlocking tradition, a tradition that's very much harmonized. It's the idea of the yogi and the kshatriya, the idea of the spiritual sage and the warrior. People always forget this, especially in the West. They want to forget this. Sanatana-Dharma is a warrior tradition. You probably will never hear another guru say this. Maybe in the Sikh tradition they'll say this, but in Sanatana-Dharma, you'll never hear another person say this, even though they know that it's true. This is a warrior tradition. This is a tradition of nobility, of kings and queens, and of tremendous and fierce and strong and courageous and brave warriors. Arjuna being only one of them. There have been thousands of such individuals. However, this is what makes being a Dharma warrior different from simply being a warrior in any other sort of way. A true warrior only fights for the defense of truth, for the defense of Dharma, for the defense of the good, for defense. So the idea is not that if you see Dharma being destroyed, if you see the innocent being attacked, or if you yourself are just minding your own business, doing the proverbial minding their own business, which so many people do, and suddenly there's someone coming toward you with a sword and they want to kill you. The idea is not that, oh, well, ahimsa means that I will just sit here and allow them to kill me. That is a person who is expressing tremendous ignorance and not very much wisdom. No. What it means to practice Dharma is that you always defend that which is good, that which is true, and by any means necessary, including violence if you have to. So this is the first stereotype about ahimsa, that what it means is pacifism. No pacifism involved. The other idea is this. Individuals will point this out quite correctly. Absolute nonviolence, people will say, is an impossibility. If you're just walking along a street in a city and you're walking along the sidewalk, unless you're walking like this, constantly looking down, you're going to step on an ant once in a while. In so many ways, we take lives. Some people have made the argument, well, aren't plants alive? So when we're eating plants, aren't we killing them? So this is one argument that people will make. Well, it's impossible to live a life of absolute nonviolence. And of course, in actuality, they'll use this as an excuse to then say, well, therefore I shouldn't be nonviolent. Therefore I have a reason now to eat meat in their minds. Well, this is what needs to be said about this. Nowhere in Sanatana-Dharma does it say that the concept of ahimsa points to the idea of radical and absolute nonviolence. The idea that we can live in such a way that throughout the span of our entire lifetime with active lives, that we can ensure that we will not kill one living being. That's an impossibility, and we do understand that. So, really, a better translation of ahimsa than nonviolence is really, conceptually, philosophically, minimization of violence. See, this is what the spiritual person who is following the path of Sanatana-Dharma actually aspires toward, is the absolute minimization of violence, not the absolute eradication of violence. So in other words, with everything we do, with every decision that we make, we try our best to minimize violence as much as is possible within any given situation. Let me back up. Let me back up a little bit. When I was talking about self-defense, okay? Again, we believe in self-defense. We believe that if someone comes after you and you're an innocent person, oh, if you need to kill that person to save yourself, you do, okay? Does this mean that in defending yourself now, you not only kill that person who has attacked you, but now you travel to that person's home and kill his entire family and his pets? Of course not. You commit the minimal amount of violence as is necessary in that circumstance. So you have one person attacking you, and you have to kill that person so that you're not killed, you kill that one person. You don't now go and kill his family and kill his pets and kill his friends, etc., etc. So again, minimization of violence in that given situation and any given situation where you find yourself. So this is the idea, is that, again, it's sad that I have to point this out again and again, but I will. Sanatana-Dharma is the most rational path on earth. You know, we never do anything to extremes, even when it comes to the concept of ahimsa, or nonviolence. Again, absolute nonviolence is not possible, so instead we minimize it as much as is possible in any given situation. This is why we eat plants rather than animals. Why? Well, it's been shown, and of course intuitively it was always understood by the sages, by the rishis, but it's also been scientifically shown in the 20th century specifically, this was decades ago, that, plants do indeed feel pain. You know, they've connected, what is it, the EKG machines or something, I forget what it was, to plants, and then, you know, kind of cut a little bit of the leaf, and there is a little pain that's registered. However, repeatedly, in experiment after experiment, it was shown that while plants do feel pain, it is so small, so minimal, as to almost not even register. Okay? This versus, have you ever tried to cut your pet dog's paw off? It will register. Trust me, it will register. Have you ever tried to cut your own finger off? You know, as in the Yakuza of Japan. You know, cut your own finger off. Oh, you're going to feel the pain. So again, if we have a choice of causing pain to a being who will feel a tremendous amount of pain, that is an animal, a human being, etc., versus a plant, which it has been shown scientifically feels very little pain. I'll get to your questions in a second. What are we to do? Again, understanding this principle of minimization of violence, you try to eat that being which feels the least amount of pain. And this is what's important to understand. You have to eat something that's alive. There is no living being, and this is a biological fact. There is no living being who exists without eating other living beings in one way or another. As human beings also, if we want to live, we have to eat something that has that vitality, that prana within it, that life force. You know, we can't eat rocks. We can't. You have to have eaten something that at one point at least was alive. That being the case, since you must eat something that was alive, at least eat that which feels the least amount of pain. Again, minimization of violence. Minimization of violence. And even for individuals who don't want to get this or who are not vegetarians, we practice this in our everyday life anyway. Again, for people who eat meat, they'll eat a cow, they'll eat a pig. Will they eat a human baby? I hope not. Most humans won't. Well, why? Because really, unconsciously, they're following the same principle. They understand that there is a tremendous difference between eating a cow versus eating a baby, and there is. Well, to take this further, there is also a tremendous difference between eating a plant versus eating a cow, eating a plant versus eating a chicken. You see. So even the meat eater follows this hierarchy of being. They will not eat a human baby. Oh, but they'll eat the cow. Well, we take it a little bit further. We won't eat the cow, but we'll eat the plant. We'll eat the vegetable. We'll eat the legume. We'll eat the grain. We'll eat the fruit. We'll have the milk of the cow, but we won't eat the cow, etc. So this is the idea of vegetarianism. It is not a superstition. You know, it's not just, as unfortunately too many Hindus think, it's not just, well, some taboo, some superstition, and I'm just vegetarian because, well, my parents were vegetarian and there's no real reason why I'm Hindu, so I guess I have to be vegetarian. No. The reason why we become vegetarian is because it is the most rational dietary lifestyle on earth. Because it is logical, because it is ethical, because it is healthy, because it helps the planet in every way imaginable. So, this is what I always ask anyone who is serious about yoga, who is serious about Sanatana-Dharma, who is serious about spiritual life. At some point, we need to put our actions where our words are. And at some point, we need to become vegetarian. And this is what I would call upon everyone to do. So with that, thank you. Namaskar.
Where do we stand on that issue?
Good question. Very similarly, actually. Again, the idea is minimization of violence. That being the case, as much as is possible, we try to avoid such things. You know, in all circumstances, it would not be possible. So I'm sure every person who came here today probably wore shoes made out of leather. You know, what can you do? This is what ultimately is of importance, is that every individual makes the greatest attempt possible to live their lives in such a way that they cause the least suffering to other beings, while at the same time not being fanatics. You see, again, this is something that I pointed out earlier in this talk, but also something that I point out all the time. To live a life of absolute, let's say, vegetarian purity would make life almost impossible. And I've known some people who have attempted this. I've known people who, they'll go out of their way to wear shoes, you know, that are not made out of leather, made out of canvas or something. Of course, the shoes fall apart, they're uncomfortable, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Once the person gets a job, they then realize that they need comfortable feet, you know, et cetera. So for each individual, ultimately, it's going to be a little bit different. But we have to weigh, on the one hand, being as ethical as possible, with, on the other hand, also being able to live a life. Let me give a very practical, very concrete example. There is this religion in Bharat, in India, known as Jainism. And a lot of people in the West know about it, some people don't, because it's a small religion. I believe there are maybe 12 million of them total in the world right now, something like that. It's a religion that is very ancient, extremely ancient. It's at least as old as Buddhism, truthfully older, a little bit older than Buddhism. But the reason why I'm bringing this up is because their main practice is ahimsa. This is something that they are fanatically dedicated to, but to the point where if you are a serious follower of the Jain religion, you need to wear a mask 24 hours a day. You know, it looks like a surgeon's mask. Why is this the case? Because the idea is that even as you're breathing in, there are little microbes that are going into you and you're killing them. Jains cannot farm because why? The idea is that when you put the plow into the ground, unknowingly you might be killing living beings. If you're a Jain, you have to carry a little broom with you. Why? Because remember the example I was giving before about how as you're walking down the sidewalk, you can't just walk like this? Well, they try to. And they'll have a little whisk in front of them and they'll go like this everywhere they walk to try to make sure that there isn't even the smallest little being that maybe they can't even perceive, but it might be there nonetheless that they might step on. Not a very practical way of existing, especially in the modern West. Nobody's going to live like that. That's a nice ideal to have, but other than maybe a tiny handful of monks who are taken care of by other people, who have other people prepare their food for them and prepare the, give them shelter, etc., etc., the typical person is never going to be able to live like that. Even the typical monk couldn't live like that. So it's not something that's very practical, And for that matter, if you're going to go to those extremes, are even those extremes enough? If you truly wanted to live according to the Jain worldview, a life of absolute nonviolence, the truth is you shouldn't even move. Because there are microbes in the air, and every time you move, you might be bumping into one and giving it brain damage. Every time you sneeze, how many germs did you just kill that just rushed out of your nose so quickly that, again, they have brain damage or they're dead? Can we keep ourselves from sneezing? No. Every time you cough, you're probably killing something. Well, what happens when you have a cold and you have to cough? Well, I guess you just have to choke to death. You see? So in other words, this is the idea, is how far can you go if you truly want to live a life of radical nonviolence? There's no limit. But then you kill yourself. And that's violent. You end up killing yourself because you can't eat, you can't drink, you can't farm. You know, and this is not, you know, in any way a criticism of the Jain religion. I'm criticizing their philosophy. What would you do with a nation of Jains? What would you do with a nation where no one could farm? You would all starve to death, you see? So what is my point? My point is that in everything that we do, what it means to be vegetarian is that we try to minimize violence as much as possible, but within the realm of reason. Within the realm of reason. You know, when in our spiritual pursuit, we go beyond the realm of reason, at that point, we're no longer in a spiritual pursuit, we're in fantasy. We're in fantasy. You know, this is why individuals who go around and say, oh, I love everyone in the world, they're in fantasy. They're lying to themselves. They don't love everyone in the world. If you were to look into their heart, there are a lot of people they hate. You know, they're lying. They're lying to themselves. And instead of being rational with how they wish to express the concept of spiritual love toward other beings, instead they want to be emotional and again live in a fantasy realm. You can't love things you don't know. We can't know all 7 billion people in the world. So to say, I love all beings, you're lying. You're living in a fantasy realm. You're not dealing in a realm of healthy spirituality. Instead, what is healthy spirituality? To say, my goal is, my wish is to ultimately love all beings. Be honest. Be humble. To say, I love all beings, well, you must be God. Because obviously you must know all beings. No, be humble about it. I would love to love all beings at some time. Be humble about it. So again, we, in practicing spirituality, always want to be within the realm of reason, not fantasy. Then it's healthy. Then it's meaningful. Then it works. You had a question?
Yeah, I have
mind. Yes, people will sometimes ask this. Well, what if you find yourself in a situation, you know, where you're in a plane, the plane crashes somewhere, and now you find yourself in a terrain where, let's say, there are no plants to eat whatsoever, but there are lots of chubby little rabbits running around, and now you have to have a choice. You know, I don't know where there is such a terrain, but we're just talking theoretically. Just imagine. In other words, the only thing there is to eat are animals. Let's say, again, the only way that you can survive there, and you know that you'll be there, let's say, for a year, so you can't just, you know, wait it out and just kind of fast. You know, it's either eat the animals or die. As a strict vegetarian, what do you do? This is the Vedic answer, if you want to know the actual Vedic answer. You eat the animals. Very simple. You eat the animals. There is no choice at that point. You see, at that point, in fact, let me back up. Ethics means choice. There is no concept of there being ethics unless there is choice. Because what it means to be ethical is that you choose to do the right thing versus the wrong thing. Okay? When choice is now, when you are now deprived of choice, now ethics is no longer involved. Now it's no longer a matter of, well, you know, let me choose not to eat these animals, you know, because there's something else I can eat. No, there is no choice. You either eat the animals or it's guaranteed you'll die. At this point, it's not an ethical decision. It's a decision of self-preservation. And you eat the animals. Of course, for an individual who is spiritual, who is a yogi, before they do that, they say a prayer. They apologize to the animal first before they kill it. They say, I'm so sorry, I have no choice here, I have to eat you or else I'm going to die. You know, and then you kill the animal in as swift a way as you can and eat it.
and how, you know, how some people are so
okay.
about
Yes. Unfortunately, in the spiritual realm, let's say, among all the however many millions of people there are out there who practice one form of spirituality or another, you will find individuals indeed who, not just vegetarianism, but any one particular principle or practice, they will become more fanatically attached to that than the actual goal. So you're right. When it comes to vegetarianism also, for individuals who claim that they are spiritual and they are becoming vegetarian for spiritual purposes, but then all they focus on is the vegetarianism, those are people who are living an unbalanced life. You know, those are people who are not practicing spirituality. Those are people who indeed have become fanatical. But instead of becoming fanatical in the sense of going up to every human being they encounter and asking, so have you accepted Jesus in your life? Instead, they ask, oh, so are you vegetarian now? It's still fanaticism. It's still annoying. It's just as annoying as any fanatic who comes up to you and tries to give you a pamphlet and tries to convert you to something. And this is why in true spirituality we try to live as balanced a life as possible. You know, this is the first thing, is to lead a balanced life. And that is with all the practices that we do, both spiritual and ethical, we practice them in an intelligent way, understanding that any one of those particular things is not the goal, to be healthy, to be vegetarian, to be good, but rather the goal is God. And all of these things will help us to understand God. Okay.
It does affect negatively your consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, again, everything we take into ourselves affects our consciousness. Yeah, everything. Everything that we see affects our consciousness. Everything we hear, everything we touch, everything we smell, taste, literally everything that comes into our senses, anything that comes into our mind, into our mind's eye, affects our consciousness. This is why we have to be extremely careful with everything. Some things affect our consciousness in a more overt sort of way. You take a hit of LSD, your consciousness will immediately be affected in a radical way. But other things will affect our consciousness in a more subtle way, where you may not detect it immediately, but over time it will affect you either for good or for bad, but it affects our consciousness nonetheless. When it comes to food, very specifically, all foods have their different properties. Not just the physical properties, but also the energetic properties, also what are called the guna properties. That is, the modes of energetic frequency of vibration of the particular thing that you're eating. The Bhagavad Gita talks about this very deeply, very extensively. It gives entire lists of foods, many things, anything that enters the consciousness, but also foods. Foods that, for example, are what are considered sattvic in nature. In other words, they are elevating to the consciousness. Foods that are rajasic in nature, that is, they make you very passionate, make you very agitated, versus foods that are what are called tamasic in nature. That is, foods that do the opposite of elevate you. They bring you down. They bring you into the lower modes of stupidity, of ignorance. You know, you eat enough of these foods and suddenly your thinking is not as sharp. Suddenly your senses are not as sharp. Suddenly the way you're viewing the world is more cynical, you know, versus positive. Foods affect us in this way. The very worst foods that we can eat, according to Bhagavad Gita, Ayurveda, Yoga, are the corporeal rotting flesh of other beings. They affect us in the worst way imaginable, as you can imagine. Just describing it, you can see why that would be the case. You know, eating something that you just picked off a tree and that is fresh and sweet and wonderful versus eating rotting flesh. That was the physical body of another being who is now dead. The soul is gone, the vitality is gone, and all that's there are some nutrients, but nothing to nurture the soul. You know? So, yeah, we are affected. Okay, you've been here a few times, so I think you know at this point my style of being very honest and blunt about everything. People who have been here longer also know this, especially about me. So let me answer the last question that you answered. A person cannot be a non-vegetarian and be enlightened. Impossible. And let me explain why. And I'll explain this as simply as possible in a way that hopefully everyone will just get it. Can a person be a serial killer and enlightened? Can a person be a psychopath and enlightened? Can a person be a child molester and enlightened? Why? Well, why not? What if a person just chooses that, hey, it's my lifestyle that I like to abuse little children, oh, but I'm also an enlightened being? You see, those questions will answer very, very easily. Oh, of course not. Well, what does it mean to be a vegetarian? It's not merely a choice in diet. It is an ethical decision. It is reflective of who you are as an ethical being. Why is it that so quickly and easily we'll say, oh, of course a child molester can't be an enlightened being? Because we understand that the very fact that it's a child molester means it's not a good person. Well, an individual who chooses out of laziness, out of wanting to simply please their tongue, to eat meat when they can choose so easily not to, what they have shown is that they are too weak to even be good. What to speak of being enlightened, which is infinitely beyond merely being good. See, being enlightened is infinitely beyond merely being ethical, and the person can't even be ethical, can't even choose to be ethical. You see, there are little teenage girls who choose to be vegetarian because they want to have a nice figure. And yet you're an enlightened being and you can't choose to be vegetarian to elevate your consciousness? And yet this little girl can do it? What does this show about this person? It shows that they're not enlightened. In the same way that if a person claims, oh yes, I'm an enlightened being, and oh, in my spare time, yes, I chase after people who are in isolated places, and I like to murder them and tear their body apart. Oh yes, but I'm an enlightened being. Well, no, you're not. No, you're not. And again, it's the exact same argument, different action, but the argument is exactly the same. The logic is exactly the same. If there are human beings who don't even aspire to be enlightened, they don't even claim that they're an enlightened being, and yet they can be a vegetarian. Oh, but yet you're an enlightened being and you cannot live a lifestyle such that your entire life is reflective of the fact that you understand the nature of love and compassion. You see. In other words, what's the word for this? Hypocrite. Hypocrite. Yeah, well, let me explain. To eat fertilized eggs is unethical. To eat unfertilized eggs is not unethical, but it's a filthy practice. It's tamasic. That's why we don't do it. Okay. If you are someone who has to drink vodka all the time, you're not necessarily doing something unethical. You're not hurting anyone necessarily. I mean, you could say you're hurting yourself, but you are doing something that is degrading your consciousness. Yeah, in the same way, when you eat unfertilized eggs, you're not doing something unethical because, yes, it wasn't something that was alive, but it's something that's yucky. It's something that is tamasic. You are eating something that came out of an animal, and came out of a very private part of an animal. It's just something that's considered tamasic. So when it comes to tamasic things, when it comes to things that vibrationally are negative, they don't all necessarily involve ethical decisions. When you listen to, let's say, gangster rap or death metal or some very negative music, there's nothing necessarily ethically involved, but you're still listening to something about violence, something that is just degrading your consciousness. If you choose to, go to a movie and, oh, okay, here's the life of, a great sage, a movie about the life of a great sage versus a teen slasher. Oh, I'm going to see the teen slasher. You haven't done anything unethical, but, you could have seen that movie about the sage and been so inspired. And instead, you decide to see something where there's murder and death and scariness. And, how do you think you would leave the movie having come from the movie about the sage versus coming from the horror movie with all this gore? It makes a difference. Again, it's not an ethical difference, but it's a difference in guna, in what's called guna or mode. Because you're not harming the animal in any way.
But you're not harming the animal if you eat an egg?
Well, that's what I'm saying. There's a difference between fertilized versus unfertilized.
Okay.
You're harming a life if it is fertilized, because obviously if it's fertilized, that means it could have come to life. If it's not fertilized, then it would not have come to life anyway. It was never a living thing. Yeah, so that's the difference. And when it comes to milk products, it's interesting. We're lacto-vegetarians. We're not vegans. So in other words, of course, veganism means that you don't even have dairy products. You have no meat, fish, eggs, but also you don't have milk, cheese, yogurt, any of this. You don't even have honey, if you're very strict. We don't believe in veganism for a lot of reasons, including very practically, it's not natural. There is no vegan who doesn't have to take vitamin supplements, B12 vitamin supplements. It's not natural. For individuals who go on and on about being militant vegans and, oh yes, we have to love nature, well, you're doing something that's not natural. How is it natural to have a diet such that you have to supplement it with vitamins, otherwise you're going to die? It's not natural. Rather, we are lacto-vegetarians, meaning that we don't eat meat, fish, eggs, but dairy products are fine. There are many reasons why, which are too numerous to go into, but let me just deal with one or two of the most important ones. First of all, by taking milk from the cow, you're helping the cow. A lot of people who don't know about farms and cows don't know this. The typical cow produces more milk than the calf needs. And truthfully, if you don't milk the cow periodically in addition to the calf drinking the milk, it's very uncomfortable for the cow, actually. It can even be dangerous for the cow. So you're doing the cow a favor by taking the excess. So that's the first thing. Not only are you not harming the cow, you're actually helping the cow by taking some of the milk away. The other thing is, there is something special about milk, and not just cow's milk, all milk, but especially cow's milk. Cow's milk and human milk are very similar in this way. There are more nutrients in milk than almost anything else conceivable. This is why God arranged it this way, that when you're a baby, you drink milk. You drink your mother's milk, with so many species, at least with mammals, is because of all the nutrients that are involved. So from a very practical perspective, it's very good for humans to have milk. Truthfully, that's not even true for all kshatriyas. Let me back up for a second and let me explain what she's asking. There have been stories in the past, including Mahabharata and other places, of great warriors who would hunt and eat the meat. And people would use this as an excuse. Well, but didn't this person and that person eat meat? Oh, so therefore, of course, that means I must be able to eat meat. Of course, they use it as a justification. Several things to be said. Number one, not all kshatriyas did this. Okay, it was the royalty, it was the nobility, even among the kshatriyas, who did this, to be very strict about this. All kshatriyas did not hunt, but the nobility did. In other words, if you were a king, you hunted. You hunted in order to refine your martial skills. That's simple. You hunted in order to make sure that you were constantly practicing your bow and arrow, your spear, all of these things that you would need as a king. The other thing is this, that afterwards, if you were a king and you hunted an animal, you actually were obliged to eat it. Yes. It's interesting. We have this tradition in so many different, among so many different peoples, including Native Americans, this idea that the relationship between the hunter and the hunted is something that's sacred. So maybe some people have heard this, it's very well known that with Native Americans, before, for example, they kill an animal, first they say a prayer. There's something that they have to actually say in a ritual form before they do that. Well, this is true also in Vedic times as well. Before the king was about to kill whatever it was, a deer or something, there were elaborate mantras that they had to say. And one of which was this. I can't remember the Sanskrit, but in English translation, it was essentially this. As I kill you today, in a future lifetime, you shall kill me. This is why, interestingly, what is the word for meat? Do you know the word? In Sanskrit, the word for meat in Sanskrit? Anyone? Mangsa. Mangsa. Do you know what this word means? Mam means me. Sa means him. In the same way that I am eating him, he will eat me in a future lifetime. Isn't that fascinating? The very word for meat is mangsa, me, him, me, him. And this is the reason why it's understood even by the Kshatriyas, even by these very powerful people, that, you know, when they were hunting and they were about to kill an animal, they understood that, no, this is a sacred event that's happening, and it's not something I'm doing lightly, and in the same way that I am doing this to you, in a future life you will do this to me, therefore from now on we're bonded. You know? Yeah, so it's not something that was taken very lightly.
And in a Shakta, they can have meat and alcohol, but they're not following the highest path. I mean, it happens a lot where they were humans and then in their next life they were an animal after that.
Well, you can't stay, I mean, it's hard to say statistically, but it all has to do with freedom, with free choice. As living beings, of course, you know, we have free choice. We make certain decisions, which then, you know, brings karma into play. And in accordance with that karma, in our future lifetimes, we either will be physically, species-wise elevated, or the opposite. We'll, you know, go into lower life forms, or in some cases, just remain human. Yeah, so statistically, it's impossible to say. But yeah. You know, what happens to a human who is just so evil, you know, that in their lifetime something has to happen to them? Well, they'll become some form of animal. What happens to humans who are incredibly good? They'll become elevated as a deva. You know? Again, it's interesting how we need to deal with spirituality rationally versus with sentiment. We understand that if we are incredibly good, okay, we haven't achieved liberation, but let's say we are incredibly ethical, you know, very religious in a very, you know, formal kind of way. Not necessarily spiritual, but religious. You know, we do lots of rituals and stuff like that. Well, how much can we elevate ourselves? You know, we can elevate ourselves tremendously to the point where we are, in our next life, a very powerful deva, and we live for, you know, 1,000,000 years, and we have vast powers, etc. Well, we understand that, and that makes us happy to know. But then, why not the converse? We have to be rational about this. You can be so evil that in your next life you'll be a bug. Of course. Of course. Again, we can't think about this sentimentally. This is a science. This is cosmology. Having been now born a bug, does that mean you're a bug for eternity? Of course not. You're just a bug for a little while. So what does this mean? It means that this is a science of consciousness and how consciousness affects the path that we are traversing within the context of space and time. That's it. Very simple. And with the element of karma also there. So we can be anything. But it all ultimately is dependent upon us. It's freedom. Freedom. Karma is freedom. Can't stress this enough. Again, another stereotype. Karma is fate. We do not believe in fate. We create our own karma of our own free will. The example that I give, you know, a person can say, well, but, you know, once you've done, let's say, once you've done something bad and now it is your karma to be a mouse in your next life, well, now isn't this your fate? Well, not really. It's a self-created destiny. You know, if I am on a cliff and I decide to commit suicide and I jump off the cliff, but now halfway down I say, oh, I shouldn't have done that. I changed my mind. You have made a decision. You're going to hit the ground. You've made a decision. In the same way, once we make a decision to do something good or bad and that karma comes into play, it has to be played out. Doesn't matter if we change our mind. But the decision ultimately was ours. We created the karma. Karma does not create us, we create karma.